an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, that was it. That was the final weekend of May here in this part of the world. It's finally taking a turn for summer. I love how we've gone from complaining about how cool and chilly and wet it was to bitching about the heat and humidity, all within 36 hours. Very good. Dave Trafford here. It's Now and Next for Story Studio Network. It's Monday, May the 29th. And a few things on the agenda we want to get to today. Just some of the stuff that I think we get so navel-gazy about here in Toronto. And we think it's only happening to us, for example. And I begin to wonder, how could it possibly be only happening here in Toronto? That, for example, the downtown core, bit of a challenge because people are working hybrid, some from home, some from work in the office, etc. And that has become sort of a clarion call as this has somehow led to congestion or a lack of, congestion in the city of Toronto. I'm not quite sure how the candidates for mayor are making that distinction, but they are. Also want to get into this whole news that broke over the weekend. It looks like the president and the head of Congress for the Republicans in the House of Representatives, Mr. McCarthy, came to a deal. They're all cheering because they're going to be able to raise the debt ceiling in the United States. And at the beginning of the conversation, I think it's a positive, but holy cow, this is so arcane and so dangerous in so many ways. And we don't really pay a lot of attention to it in this part of the world, but we probably should, given that last week they were saying that household debt in this country in Canada is the highest of any G7 country. CMHC says the high home prices are to blame for the ballooning debt. Okay. But by comparison, the debt in the U.S. and households in the U.K. have shrunk in the last 10 years. We're going the other way. We want to be number one. So we're excited about that. And so we're thrilled to include in the conversation this morning Preet Banerjee. Haven't talked to you in a while. Of course, he is a personal finance advisor, etc. Now in London of the UK. By the way, are they having the same kind of problems there? I mean, in terms of this hybrid issue. And when I say it's a problem, here in Toronto it's a problem, as you will know, because so many companies, businesses, small businesses, say in the path, or retailers or restaurants, relied on you and me going into the office every day because we'd go out for lunch.
Yeah, I think it's less of an issue here. I mean, people are sort of striking and banging on the same sort of drum in terms of talking points, but transit is so much better here. It's always been busy, and in the last year or so, it's just now getting back up to maybe 75% of the volumes that you saw before. But even before that, it's such a tourist town that this place is always busy. But employers and employees are also having that struggle of, well, what is better for the bottom line? What's better for productivity? And in some cases, it may make more sense for people to stay home and work remotely. And in other cases, it doesn't. I think it depends on the industry, the type of business that you're in, and the individual circumstances, because one company would likely have multiple policies going forward. There's no one size that fits all. No,
exactly. And I think that's sort of, as I listen to the debate, as such as it is, unfold on the campaign trail here for mayor in Toronto, that it's not about the thing in front of your face, that in fact there are these longer term issues that Toronto is going to have to be reshaped. It's reshaping on its own, whether we like it or not. And being able to say, this is the new Toronto. This is the new economic model. This is the new business model that we're going to all have to embrace or actually encourage. Because even at 75% returning to the office in London, that's a significant number of people who are not, walking around, again, picking up the sandwich at lunch or dropping off the dry cleaning or whatever it might be. So there is a local economic impact at some level.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's different with Toronto is that everything is in that downtown core. London is much more spread out. And the path is very unique to Toronto and the businesses that were in the path and the types of businesses they support, which is all heavily financial services and heavily anything that can be done from a laptop from anywhere. Whereas across, the UK and across London, it feels like a much more diversified economy. Toronto really feels like it's a financial capital, whereas the UK and London, still a financial capital, but there's also so many more industries as well to sort of pick up that slack. So totally different places. And when I go back to Toronto, I keep wondering, I know that not a lot of people, certainly not 100% of people have gone back to work downtown in the core. And I'm wondering, why is there still so much traffic congestion? It's nothing to do with people working from home or not. It's just poor planning overall that's caught up with us.
Yeah, and I mean, to the planning point, I mean, again, you've kind of touched on this, the diversity of the distribution of and the location of some of these retailers and the various businesses inoculates you to some degree from the direct impact that we're experiencing here in Toronto. Nobody's talking about, let's have a more diverse ecosystem for that kind of business in Toronto. I think that's where we really need to be at. Otherwise, to your point, we're still arguing about whether we should be tearing down the Gardiner 7, 10, 12, 15 years later. Okay, so I mean, I know that wasn't on the agenda, but I just, for some perspective, it's good to have that from the outside of our own borders. Listen, I sent you this note, I guess it was Thursday-ish, it was late last week, just say, I want you to come on and we want to talk about this debt ceiling. Mm-hmm. And I hear very little reporting on it outside of, certainly not in Canada. We absorb what happens from the United States, we take what happens from the cable news. But as I will listen to all of this, and I'm thinking, wow, we're worried about, again, people returning to the office towers, as if that's going to make or break how things are going to go. We're talking about the possibility, less likely now, that the United States government was going to default on the loans it has sitting out there. And we're not talking about pocket change. If they had defaulted on that, and to me, it would have been, and I'm no financial expert, I'm just a guy who's sitting on the sidelines observing this. But the implications of that were extraordinary to the point where that in and of itself could have caused not just a recession, but a deep recession, if not a depression in our economy. We think COVID was bad, and we breathlessly reported on that. We paid little to no attention to what's going on in Washington and the jeopardy that the politics one way or the other is having in terms of where we would be globally for the economy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I echo your sentiment that it's appalling how little coverage this has gotten. I think part of the reason for that is that the debt ceiling has been raised, I think it's 76 times since 1960 in the U.S. And so this is something that's happened before many times, to the point that Aaron Sorkin, who is a writer for a lot of famous TV shows like The West Wing and The Newsroom, he's almost made it one of his pet causes that he incorporates into every show he writes about is the debt limit in the United States and the political brinksmanship that comes along with it. If you look around the world, I think there's only 2 countries in the world that have any type of debt limit. One is Denmark, and their debt limit is so stratospherically higher than the amount of debt that they carry that there's no likelihood that they'll ever come close to it. Whereas with the U.S., they bump up against it every single year. And you think about the absurdity of this particular system. So the U.S. debt limit is a imposed limit to the total amount of debt that the government can take on. And they vote on increasing this limit as they need to. But the process seems completely backwards, because what tends to happen is you see a bill go through Congress, through the Senate, and it might have a spending tab attached to it. So they might say something like, we're going to make a change to Social Security. It's going to cost an extra $100 billion. And they'll fight about it, and they'll make their vote. And when they vote, and if it passes, they know that the cost of that is going to be an extra, $100 billion over the next number of years, whatever it is. They also know how much they're currently spending as a government. So this is not like unknown numbers. And so they know that if they are going to breach that debt limit, which is set in law, they know this when they're voting on these bills. And the spending limit, the debt limit rather, and the ceiling that they have when it is about to get breached, they're basically coming back a second time to say, hey, you remember all those bills that we passed knowing fully well what they were costed out as? Now we're going to vote on whether or not we're going to pay those bills that we racked up and we agreed to rack up. And it's very backwards. And it turns this into complete political theater. But the reason why it's so important is that U.S. Treasuries are considered the most risk-free asset in the world, the entire world. It is the lowest rate of interest on debt around the world, and it's the benchmark from which all other debt is based off of. And so when you say this is a risk-free asset, and it is clearly in risk of being defaulted on this debt, it is no longer a risk-free asset. And so even just the thought that the U.S. would default on what is considered the safest asset in the world would have such deep ramifications, millions of jobs lost in the U.S., if it was a prolonged default. The ramifications systemically would be huge. Deep recession, and if that happens in the U.S., Canada's biggest trading partner, we know there's the saying, if that they sneeze, we get a cold, right? So this is a big deal.
Well, and it is a big deal, and to the extent, and I'm glad you brought up the whole idea that, we're if not the largest trading partner among them with the U.S. And the ramification would be felt almost immediately, and I don't see, and maybe there isn't a way to do this, but I don't see any way where we protect ourselves from this, because this conversation in Washington happens now, as you point out, almost every 2 or 3 years, depending on when the conversation starts, because it's being used as a political cudgel. But what I find extraordinary is again that sort of backward view to it. We have approved all of this spending. We've got whether it's healthcare or social services or infrastructure or whatever, and nobody's paying any attention to the actual amount of money that's available to be spent. So this has been historically and systemically baked into what's going on. And, in years past, you'd say it'll never happen in the United States. We got Donald Trump. So I think the "it will never happen" phrase kind of gets washed, away a little bit from that perspective. I would worry, okay, we came close and we still have to have this voted on, and there's still going to be a push by Republicans to say no to it. That there is a mentality here, Preet, where to hell with it, we'll go, we'll risk actually, seeing going into default on this. I'm not even quite sure that that's rational. Never mind, long-term healthy.
Yeah, no, I think it is irrational, and I think that the confidence that investors, countries around the world have in the United States' economy and financial system gets shaken. Because if you continue to get this close, and I think enough crazy stuff has happened in the past that a lot of people said, I never thought in a million years I would ever see X or Y or Z. Now I think people are starting to realize that, maybe someone could be crazy enough to actually cause the U.S. to default on its own debt because of political brinksmanship, because they want to show the rest of the party or voters, whatever, that, hey, I stand for XYZ values, and we're going to hold this government to account. We're not going to allow them to go over this debt limit. Not realizing that if they ever cause the U.S. to default on its debt, that it would be the single biggest own goal in the history of the world. It would be such a unnecessary and a completely avoidable event that would have catastrophic effects for, in the words of Timothy Geithner, former Secretary of the Treasury in the U.S. under Obama, would have impacts for potentially generations of Americans.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you can't be a little bit in default. Once this starts rolling down the hill, you're not getting in the way of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the the faith and the confidence that people have in the U.S.'s ability to pay its debts is so foundational to the global economic system that if they were to default on it, it would be absolutely. I think it would be unimaginable what the consequences would be.
Two things. What's the impact on the currency then? I mean, I imagine that's in the toilet as well.
Well, depending how far things go, so they struck a deal over the weekend. It still has to go through Congress. And again, here's where more political theater comes into play, because you've got people on both the Republican side and the Democrat side saying, well, there's things about this deal that we don't like, and I don't know if I'm going to vote in line with this deal, which is just at this point maniacal if they continue to test the world's confidence in the U.S. financial system. But if they're, just to give you an example of what the ramifications might be. So we know that, when something is lower risk, like if you go to a bank and you've got lots of money and you maybe don't need to borrow a lot of money, if you go and ask for a loan, you're going to get a very low interest rate, because they're going to say, yeah, you look very creditworthy, so we're going to give you a very low rate of interest, our prime rate of interest, which is the interest rate we offer to our best customers. If you have missed payments, your contracts will say things like, well, you missed 2 credit card payments in a row, we're going to jack up your credit card interest rates 10%. If you have missed a few payments on an auto loan, they say, you know what, you're not as creditworthy as our best customers, so we're going to charge you 2 or 3% more on lending you money. And it's the same thing that would happen, except the ramifications would be widespread. So the interest rate that the U.S. government would have to pay on its debt would go up, because now everyone's going to say, well, you missed a payment. You used to be the most the safest bet in the world, and you missed a payment. That means the interest rates have to go up, which means everybody's interest rate goes up on all borrowings, whether it's auto loans, mortgages, you name it. Business investment, the loans for starting a business will go up, and that will have a negative impact on growth as well. And part of the reason we're in this mess is, interest rates have been so low for so long, and people have overborrowed. And we're now starting to see in Canada situations where, as interest rates have gone up, this is pushing people over the edge in terms of their household balance sheets. It's the same thing for corporations and for governments. So, the impact of missing a payment for the U.S. government and defaulting on its debt would increase the cost of borrowing for everybody. And everyone has already borrowed so much that if you increase the cost of servicing what they've already taken on in terms of their obligations, a lot of people get pushed over that edge.
Again, a complicated situation. But so who holds this debt? Who owns the debt that the Americans have?
A lot of individuals hold it. Actually, the U.S. government itself holds about a third of its own debt in terms of inside, Medicare and Social Security system and what have you. I think about 25 to 30% is held by investors around the world and other countries that hold U.S. treasuries. But a lot of individuals, like if you think of, your own investment portfolio or your sort of portion of the Canada Pension Plan, these big funds invest in a whole bunch of different types of investments. Some are stocks in companies, and some are bonds, which are issued by, in some cases, corporations, some cases by governments like the U.S. So a lot of everyday investors hold some of this debt as part of their investment portfolios.
So they'd be the first to feel this or scramble to actually make up whatever implication there was.
Yeah, I feel like that would almost be the secondary concern with respect to the immediate impact of just some estimates say that the GDP of the U.S. would immediately drop by about 4%. 4% drop in GDP is astounding to happen in a short period of time. So job losses, that is going to be more of a concern than, a decrease in the value of investments. Also a concern, but I think the immediate, fallout in terms of job loss, people spending less confidence in the system, leading to recession, teetering towards, I don't want to say depression, but very nasty, like 2008 level of bad.
Yeah, well, I mean, you start to think of the cycle then. Lost jobs, lost homes, no social services to support those folks who need that benefit, the healthcare, all that kind of thing. And it becomes pretty dire in a hurry. Now, on the optimistic side, and again, they are waving the flag saying this is, we're charging to the savior here, is they've got their, quote, deal. But but there's nothing in the deal that guarantees, as you point out, that it's going to go ahead, because somebody will stand up and politically make a dance around it and say, look at me, and that's to be expected. On the other side of this, that, you know, it only emboldens this to happen again, because all they're doing is saying, it will be like you used the credit card analogy already. I would think that the last thing, the credit card company might jack up my interest rate, but the last thing they're going to do is to, hey, Dave, here's another $100,000 you can, spend on your credit card, rack up on your credit card. And that's what they're doing here.
Yeah, I think what will possibly come out of this, and we've heard some representatives in the U.S. suggest that this should be put on the table, is rethinking the whole idea of the U.S. even having a debt ceiling. Because if the process, as I talked about, is backwards, where they will vote on certain programs like that require spending or tax cuts, which would reduce revenue, they know what the impact would be to the budget. And so when they're voting on these things, shouldn't they take that into account and not have to then come back later on and say, okay, are we now going to approve the thing that we already approved after analyzing it to death before? It just seems backwards. And again, one of only two countries, and realistically the only country that ever runs up against the debt limits that are imposed for the nation in the entire world. Every other country in the world, as far as I know, does not have a mechanism like this. So I think there will be some people saying, this is being used too much for political brinksmanship, and it's a detriment to the country overall, because the fact that they're willing to bump up against this limit so much and hold the country hostage for a few weeks at a time every couple of years, that impacts the confidence that the world has on the United States and the financial system as a whole.
And it's a self-inflicted wound to begin with. I mean, you already talked, it would be an own goal if they failed, but it's self-inflicted in as much as this was an arbitrary decision that at some point the government in the United States decided. And I'm sure it was well-intended to say, show the people of the United States we're not going to spend more than our means. Well, that's completely out the window.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a function of this almost, do I even want to say this anti-intellectualism sort of stance about politicians, where it used to be we seem to have people who are really well thought out.
Critical thinkers.
Yeah.
Right?
And now it's about grandstanding and dunking on people and proving points without understanding the ramifications of what they're doing. And I hope that this is as close as we ever get to it. If we ever do actually see the U.S. default on its debt, again, it's never happened. There's no precedent for it. All the estimates are it would be very, very bad for everyone, including Canadians.
Well, I'll just close on the Trump debate. And, he said as president, we'd go to the edge. and again, we'll laugh at that, right?
Yeah.
But there is a distinct possibility that clown could be the next president of the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, under his administration, under a Republican government, is when a lot of, some of these revenues were cut in the form of tax cuts, which contributed largely to this problem. And so, if you take a look at how many times the debt ceiling has been raised, it's been raised more times under Republicans than under Democratic governments. And I know a lot of people will say, well, whoever's in charge at the time, they're the ones who are responsible for it. But it's because there's such a long lead time of these previously made decisions that led to them being in a position. You can't necessarily cleanly tie why is the debt amount approaching this limit and exceeding it, which they actually did exceed it in January. It's just they haven't missed payments yet. Because they've taken measures to sort of say, all right, let's cut some expenses here and there so we make sure that we don't default. But the Secretary of the Treasury has, written official letters to Congress saying, listen, you guys need to get on top of this, because if the U.S. defaults, it's going to lead to catastrophic issues. So again, they've struck a deal, still has to pass through Congress. Looks like it probably will. But the fact that they keep on doing this, it threatens the confidence of the U.S.'s financial system.
Preet Banerjee, it's good to see you, good to connect with you. It's been a while, and I'm glad you have your insights on this stuff. We appreciate it.
Anytime, Dave.
Preet Banerjee is the founder of Money Gaps, and you hear him from time to time as a contributor on John Moore's show on News Talk 1010. That'll do it for us here on Now and Next. Tomorrow, we're going to talk to David Coletto at Abacus. He's done a deep dive prior to the election in Alberta. The Albertans go to the polls today. We'll see what the tea leaves present tomorrow, and we'll get a sense of not just what happened on Election Day, but how it all unfolded. And will Danielle Smith actually be the premier for another term, or will Rachel Notley come back and be the premier for a second time? So David will come in and join us tomorrow, and we'll talk about Alberta's politics right here on Now and Next for Story Studio Network.
Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.